All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are continuing with a very special broadcast on the high-stakes meeting between the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and President Donald Trump on the sidelines of the G7 meeting in Evian. In fact, after that meeting, the duo also held a joint press conference as well, with a couple of questions being addressed. And you're watching India Tonight. In fact, we'll have a stellar panel of guests joining us in just a short while from now. But let me take you through some of the key takeaways. Both the sides, in fact, talked about everything under the sun. There was no aspect that was not touched upon. But let's begin with what the Prime Minister had to say to President Donald Trump. One of the very key issues that's been a little bit of an irritant in ties between the two sides. The ties between the two sides I wouldn't say have been tensed, but have been on the mend since last year, since President Donald Trump's tariff policy came into effect. In fact, the Prime Minister addressed the concern about freedom of navigation and, of course, the safety of Indian seafarers. He said that Indian seafarers are working across global maritime trade routes, and the safety of seafarers is important. So, of course, many were anticipating whether this will be brought up once again or not in presence of Donald Trump. This bilateral with President Donald Trump, but this did come up. Now, what did President Donald Trump say? What did he essentially touched upon? He said that Prime Minister Modi is a tough negotiator. He's a tough trader in his words. And of course, he agreed that he's going to come to India. So, of course, all eyes will be on that very crucial meeting, on that very crucial visit, whether this is going to be for the Quad Summit, which is slated to happen in September or later. That remains to be seen, but definitely some progress as it can be seen from what he spoke about has been discussed with respect to the trade deal. He also spoke about reimposing sanctions on Russia that will depend on oil prices. He said that Iran deal is a war to a nuclear weapon, and India plays a role in everything across the world, everything across the globe. But one very critical statement that he made was with respect to India's anti-terror stance. He said that if anyone attacks India, we would be there to help India. In fact, he reiterated twice at least in front of the press just a while back, and these are some of the pictures of that deferred live that we're showing on your television screen. So without any further ado, let me go across to the panel of guests that is joining me now. In fact, we're continuing with the panel that we had earlier. Ray Locker joins us. He's an author, a presidential historian. Vidisha Bhattacharya, Associate Fellow, Chintan Research Foundation, and Rajkamal Rao is the MD of Rao Advisors and an OPID columnist. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and Vidisha, for waiting so very patiently. Like all of us, there was a lot of anticipation, a lot of build-up. We were also discussing about, what will be the likely points of discussion and whether or not the safety of Indian seafarers and the fact that, 3 of our seafarers actually died will be touched upon or not. And, that was brought up by the Prime Minister in that press conference. In fact, it was one of the very important points that was mentioned. So let me begin with you, Ray Locker. Your first thoughts on the press conference that transpired, and what does it really say about the behind-the-scenes meeting, the bilateral that happened between both the sides?
Well, I think it's very interesting that Trump said that he would defend India in any kind of terrorist attack. I mean, this comes after he's been extremely cozy with the Pakistani government, and we all know, what they've been responsible for in terms of supporting Lashkar-e-Taiba and their involvement in the Mumbai attacks. So I found that very curious. I hope it's true. I mean, because that's the right thing to do. But with Trump, he says so many different things, and it's hard to tell what he really means or if he means what he says.
All right. Let me also get in your first thoughts, Bidisha.
I think it was quite a pertinent interaction with the media as well. And I feel like the very line that Mr. Trump said, that he's a tough negotiator, Mr. Modi is a tough negotiator. This is something that I found very positive, in fact, because beyond goods and energy, there's a third dimension, as I was discussing prior to, the interaction, specifically, which is the digital trade and supply chain architecture, because the interim agreement had explicitly commits India to negotiate a robust set of bilateral digital trade rules addressing data localization, cross-border data flows. So for Amazon, Google, Meta, Apple, this matters enormously. But India's Digital Personal Data Protection Act is built on a specific philosophical foundation, one that asserts Indian regulatory sovereignty over data generated on Indian soil. So that's something that I believe that we need to look forward to. And then there's the supply chain dimension, as you know, speaking of China. The joint statement language about quote unquote economic security alignment and cooperation, investment reviews and export controls. I believe that this is the explicit architecture of a China alternative supply chain. So the US wants India definitely as an anchor in semiconductors and critical minerals and defense manufacturing and pharmaceuticals. We had some very positive points from the defense on the defense front as well. So the geopolitical premium embedded in this partnership is quite real and it is large.
Right, and let me get in a word from you, Mr. Rajkamal Rao. Mr. Rao, we were talking about a whole lot that will be touched upon. In fact, indeed, that has been talked about. Trade deal, where the president said that Prime Minister Modi is a very tough negotiator. He looks kind, but he is a tough negotiator. Those were his words. What do you think would have transpired when it comes to matters related to the trade deal? How soon do you think the trade deal will happen and finally be signed?
Yeah, so obviously, one never knows. But I was, as I said to you in the earlier segment, I think the personal chemistry between the two of them, I think Trump alluded to that quite a few times. You were talking about how the US would go and stand for India and support India if India is attacked. But then he also said that he would only do it if Modi is the leader. So, and he again, mentioned about that, the big Ahmedabad, stadium. So Trump, Trump and Modi, they actually do get along, and no matter what is happening, that is going to be the most important, I would say, element this relationship going forward. And I think hopefully that will actually translate into a trade deal. Now that, as I said before, the IEPA the ruling has come out, Trump has to deal. I mean, he cannot not deal. And I think that's where it's going to go.
Absolutely. And there are minor irritants with respect to India's concerns on Section 301 investigations. And how do these really go? That remains to be seen. But at this moment, ladies and gentlemen, let me also welcome on the show Mr. Deepak Bhojwani. Is a former Indian ambassador to Latin America. Also joining him is Jayant Krishna, Senior Fellow, Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Krishna, we're going to be coming to you on the trade aspect of these talks. But let me first get in a word from Mr. Bhojwani. Mr. Bhojwani, has this meeting really helped ties between the two sides being reset? Because there have been a bit of sort of irritants in the past, even though both the sides have tried to sort of, get the bilateral relations back between India and the United States. However, how would you sort of describe this?
Look, I've been a practitioner on this stage. I was there in the 80s and the 90s when the two countries were talking trade and also defense ties and so on and so forth. What really matters incredibly importantly, is what happens, what are the results. We've seen in all dimensions of the relationship, there has been substance, sure, but there have also been massive, not just frictions, there have been massive chasms that have developed. Trump's tariffs that were announced last year hit us in the face, not as a slap, but as a blow. I think it's important that we see what results come out. I mean, having an 18% tariff on Indian imports and virtually tariff-free US exports in many dimensions is something that India is going to have to probably live with. But on top of that, we've seen that we've been threatened with Super 301, which was a law which we had to deal with in the 80s under Ronald Reagan. And the US has been using these levers. They've also been using unilateral sanctions, preventing us from buying oil, which we should be free to do wherever we want to. We've had to do all kinds of maneuvers to get Russian oil under Vostro accounts and so on and so forth. So I would wait and see what results transpire. I'm not interested in a personal relationship between Prime Minister Modi and President Donald Trump. They are not individuals. They are president and prime minister of their countries, respectively. And what matters is what the country gets out of this negotiation, all these negotiations.
Absolutely, absolutely, Mr. Bhujwani. Very well put. Camaraderie aside, but what really comes out of this relationship, this personal friendship that the two premiers enjoy, and what will it really mean for the outcomes for India? That remains to be seen. Mr. Krishna, if you could please weigh in on that. How will that really reflect in India getting a deal that it wants? It wants a deal with preferential access and, of course, a better deal as far as competitors in its neighborhood are concerned. Do you think the US administration is perhaps going to sort of consider some of India's concerns?
See, one thing, let me clarify at the onset. In these kind of mega summits which happen, the global summits, be it G7, be it G20, the bilateral meetings are often not as serious and not as detailed as it would be a normal bilateral when one head of the state or head of the government flies to another country to have this meeting. I mean, there's a larger team, and it's a very, very serious discussion. So I personally do not think, despite the fact that we have yet not been able to sign even the interim trade deal, I don't think there'll be much progress on that in this short bilateral that President Trump and Prime Minister Modi are going to have. President Trump would definitely ask for greater access to Indian markets for some of their products like corn, soybean, cheese, and so on and so forth. And India's stand has always been that we have to protect the interest of our farmers and dairy entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. It cannot happen. So I mean, there will surely be a reference, but it will not be anywhere near resolution in this bilateral which is happening right now. But I think what will happen, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he's coming to India shortly in a week's time or so, later this month itself. I'm sorry, the U.S. trade representative is coming there, coming to India, the Jamison Greer, he's going to come here. And that is when some of the loose ends which are yet not tied up will get done between him and Mr. Piyush Goyal, our Commerce Minister, and so on and so forth. So I think that is very important. But some of the things which are, beyond trade deal, which are very, very important, are likely to be taken up in this bilateral, which people are not talking about in general, are the Quad. President Trump is expected to come to India this year, but his office has still not confirmed. And Quad is not a very huge set of nations. There are only 4 countries: US, India, Australia, and Japan, right? And if US does not show the same kind of warmth towards this grouping of countries for a specific purpose, then it can't move ahead at all. So I think Prime Minister Modi would try to extract a promise from President Trump that he should be visiting India for the Quad summit later this year. And the second issue is about mobility. President Trump had come down very heavily on H-1B visa, both in terms of cutting the numbers and also imposing a hefty fee of $100,000 with the application itself. Now, one of the federal U.S. court judges has struck it down and said it is illegal because it did not go through the Congress approval. It is not just an application fee, it is actually a tax which should have gone through the proper route for approval. So I think President, and right now U.S. administration has not gone to court to repeal that against that judgment, right? So I think Prime Minister Modi again has to use his skills and his personal rapport with President Trump, that it is actually for the good of US, right? I mean, US does not do any favor to India by giving us H-1B visas. Very clearly, US has very serious skill deficits in areas like technology, computers, healthcare, medical sciences, and so on and so forth. And we meet that. India meets that. US industry needs us, right? So I think he has to talk the shop. And last but not the least, I think Prime Minister Modi, being the voice of the global South, has to come out very clearly that, things like, the US, Israel, and Iran war, the kind of turmoil it has created in terms of disturbing the energy security in the country, not in the entire world. The crude oil import bill has gone up. In many countries, the currencies have been devalued vis-a-vis US dollar. and the balance of trade payment balance of payment situation has gone adverse, kind of a thing.
Right.
So how global South is actually paying the cost
Right.
of such a turmoil. So I think these are the key messages beyond the
Right.
trade deal, which I'm sure will come in some shape or size when this meeting takes place. It's already taking place, I suppose.
Absolutely, Mr. Krishna. Mr. Krishna, when you mentioned that point, let me ask you a follow-up question, and then we'll go to the rest of the panel as well. Mr. Krishna, when you mentioned about the fact that, the implications have been borne by nations here in the global South, but it is also important and pertinent to note that the Americans, the United States has also been facing the impact of its own decisions, its own policy decisions. So whether it's related to the inflation data that we get, or perhaps the unemployment, and of course the general dissatisfaction in American citizens, that could perhaps be weighing heavy on President Donald Trump ahead of midterms. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. Yes, I mean his popularity ratings are not as high when he was elected. They have surely suffered, and midterms are not as far off. And so he has to be cognizant of these developments and the fact that his actions, have created. And very often, sometimes experts feel that his behavior on a particular day depends on which side of the bed he gets up from, right? So I think with this kind of an attitude, one day he'll call Prime Minister Modi his friend and so on and so forth. Next day he'll call India as a failed economy. Third day he'll say, oh, Modi is a great killer, and and he's a cool guy, very very positive words he'll use, and next day he'll say, oh, we have lost India and Russia to China. So I think those kind of things are happening every now and then. And he has to be, I am sure he's cognizant of that. And that's the reason, when he went to China, China in a way cold-shouldered him and showed a big brother attitude. And Europe also, I think President Trump has given a clear signal that, he's negotiating, he's discussing, and he's with them, especially with regard to the Russia-Ukraine war and more sanctions against Russia, right, and respecting the sovereignty of Ukraine.
Right.
So I think things are changing, and as you rightly said, he's cognizant of that, and some of that is reflected in his body language, and I'm sure in some form it will have a manifestation in the bilateral with Prime Minister Modi as well.
Very important point that you've made about body language, perhaps a marked difference from what we saw yesterday to what we saw just a short while back. In fact, the two leaders stopping short of a hug, but definitely held hands multiple times. And of course, the president's praise for the prime minister, that showed through as well. But let me come to you, Mr. Bhojwani. Mr. Bhojwani, President Trump also said on defense matters that India-US defense relationship is great, and that if India is attacked, we would be there to help them. In fact, he stated that twice. Should this be considered as an endorsement of India's strong anti-terror stance against Pakistan?
I don't think so. Currently, the US is in bed, and Pakistan is in bed with the US. I think we should be absolutely certain they are not going to help us when it comes to matters of terrorism. A single vote in the UN Security Council terrorist list doesn't make a difference on the Balochistan Liberation Army and so on and so forth. The US is extremely transactional, and more so now under President Trump. Let's not be under any illusion. I was in the Americas division in the 80s when they were twisting our arms on Kashmir. They have not been in our camp when it comes to even defense matters, because we do not get the top defense technology that we will be entitled to, which is one of the reasons why we not have a single US fighter jet in our arsenal. We have transport planes and we bought some helicopters, and that to some extent is to appease Donald Trump, because he's saying we don't buy enough from them. So let's not be under any illusion. Even the Quad, I don't think we're going to get much out of the Quad, because priorities under Donald Trump have changed. He is calling it the G2 in front of Mr. Modi, and he's asking the audience whether they really know what the G2 is. So that tells you where his priorities are. He's interested in Ukraine only to the extent that he can keep his relationship with President Putin, which is fine. But even on the defense front, we've seen that we do not exercise the kind of priorities that most other allies or most other countries who are allied with the US have, like, Korea, Japan, and so on and so forth. We're very far down the line. Having said that, what does he mean when he says if we are attacked, US will come to our help? there is very little prospect of a skirmish or a conflict with China, leave alone a conflict, even a skirmish. We've managed that much better. However, the biggest problem is Pakistan. Tomorrow, if there is a skirmish between India and Pakistan, does anyone believe that the US will come down on our side? Not at all. So let's be realistic about this. Trump will say anything he wants people to hear, but I would take it with a large pinch of salt, and so, at least as far as defense.
Right, Ambassador Bhojwani. Let me also take the point across to Mr. Ray Locker. Mr. Locker, since you have been a president historian, what the United States does and what it actually says is very different, and that India should not rely on the US when it comes to its own security. Would you agree with what Ambassador Bhojwani was saying?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, the U.S.-India relationship has been up and down for a long time. You know, I've written about President Richard Nixon and his relationships with India and how so many people were puzzled by how he bent over backwards to help Pakistan in the early 70s. And he was using Pakistan to get to China, and he didn't care what India thought about it. And so now we have Trump says anything he wants to say at any time if he thinks he's going to get something from it. And then he forgets he said it or lies about saying it. So I don't think he's going to really do anything differently than he has been doing. And his cozying up to Pakistan, I just find absolutely puzzling, given all the other things that have happened. It's obvious we have to have a relationship with Pakistan because of all our other concerns in the region, but he's gone way beyond anything that I thought he would do or should do. And the fact is, you know, the ties with India are probably the most important in the region. We share a common democracy. We share a language in many respects. I mean, the relationship is there. The Indian diaspora in the United States is big and getting bigger. We absolutely do need their H-1B visa workers to keep going in our tech industry. So there are so many reasons why this should be a stronger relationship than it is. And I don't think Trump is the guy who's going to make it any better.
Right, with that, gentlemen, it's now time for us to wrap up this a very intriguing discussion. Thank you very much for your time and sharing your perspectives on this very important and breaking story. At the moment, ladies and gentlemen, I have some more news for you. Coming in on the India-UK trade agreement, because the UK Trade Department has confirmed that UK and India have agreed that the India-UK free trade agreement will come into effect on 15th July, an historic moment for modern UK and India's partnership for unlocking a new era of growth for both of our economies. Now, to be sure, both India and the United Kingdom, they sealed a pact earlier this year. In fact, last year it was sealed, and they were expected to sort of put this into operation, put this into effect. In fact, this year itself, however, there were two concerns that both the sides, that primarily India had of the UK. It was related to the CBAM issue and, of course, steel-related tariffs. And, of course, we were given to understand by India's Ministry of Commerce that in the past few days, one of the three matters were discussed. They were cleared. So, of course, this news pretty much confirms that India and the UK have agreed that the India-UK free trade agreement is going to come into effect on 15th July. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's a wrap on this edition of India Tonight. Thanks for watching.